An open convention happens when there is no predetermined nominee at the start of a convention. While open conventions in the modern era are relatively rare, they were the way political parties chose their presidential nominees throughout much of America's history. The introduction of the primary system in the early 1900s, in which states set up nominating contests, began to shift the way parties selected their nominees. However, primaries during the first half of the century were still secondary in importance to nominating conventions. Political leaders used the primaries to test the viability of possible candidates, but the conventions still determined the nomination outcome. The most significant change to the party convention system came from the 1968 Democratic Convention in Chicago. Convention leaders chose Hubert Humphrey as the nominee, despite Eugene McCarthy, an anti-war candidate, receiving more primary votes. The choice led to protests and violence outside the convention and political upheaval inside the hall. In the following years, both parties initiated reforms to ensure a majority of convention delegates were bound to the primary election outcomes. Democrats further changed their rules after the 2016 election when many superdelegates, unpledged delegates who are party leaders, announced early support for Hillary Clinton, creating the perception that they were trying to influence the nominating contest against Bernie Sanders. Beginning in the 2020 election, the superdelegates were no longer allowed to vote in the first ballot at the convention unless there was no doubt about the outcome of the contest. The U.S. Constitution does not mention parties or their nomination processes. However, the Supreme Court has recognized political parties as being covered by the Freedom of Association Clause of the First Amendment. Over the years, courts have given political parties wide latitude on how they operate. The roughly 4,000 Democratic delegates have strong ties to their political party. They can include local party workers, union members, office holders, and fundraisers. While voters cast ballots for delegate slots tied to the presidential candidates, the delegates themselves are often not chosen until weeks or months after the primary vote. If there is not a contested election, the identity of the individual delegates does not matter much to the average voter. The delegates will cheer at the convention and will formally nominate the party's presidential candidate. However, in the case of a contested election, the delegates could matter a great deal with the freedom to back any candidate. Pledged delegates make up the majority of delegates, about 85%, and are pledged to back the candidate that voters elected. However, in the absence of that candidate, pledged delegates can back any nominee. Superdelegates, who are leaders and elected officials in the Democratic Party, cannot vote on the first ballot in contested elections, but on subsequent ballots, they can vote for any candidate they choose. History shows that nominees who prevail in contested conventions have a harder time winning the White House. A Pew Research study found that of the 60 Democratic and Republican nominating conventions from 1868, the first post-Civil War election, to 1984, 18 candidates were nominated on multiple ballots. Of those, only 7, less than 40%, were elected president.